Unknown. The light on 13th May 1943 came up thin over the Cap Bon Hills, the sky a sheet of hammered tin, the wadis the color of spent brass. Wind hissed through thorn and empty petrol tins, a dry rattle that made Gefreiter Karl Weiss think of belt links feeding through an MG-34. He tightened the loose strap on his pack and felt the bone under his own skin. His Carabiner 98K lay across his knees, bolt gritty, stock polished by months of use and a final week of futility. In the dark hours, their lieutenant had read the order in a tired classroom voice. The 10th Panzer Division would stack arms at dawn. No drama, no parade, just the end. Heat lifted with the sun, carrying dust and the faint tang of salt. Across the low ridge came a sound like a factory breathing, steady, unhurried, thick with certainty. Trucks appeared, GMCC CKW 2.5-ton Jimmies, canvas tops pale, tailgates chalked with codes. They looked like logistics made flesh. Crates rode under netting, water tins, ammunition, rations, items that, in the last week, 5 men in Karl's section had learned to divide by spoon and sip. Now the convoy did not end. He realized defeat did not always arrive with shock and flame. Sometimes it arrived as continuity. White flags wagged from stick poles over a flat of scrub. British and American officers moved through clusters of prisoners with a tempo that was both brisk and routine. A U.S. medic, freckles flaring under sunburn, pressed a canteen into Karl's hand. The water was cold. It shocked his teeth and throat. He drank fast, coughed, then nodded thanks he had not meant to give. The medic's grin was not triumph. It was procedure. Later, Karl would learn the phrase from the 1929 Geneva Convention, rations equal in quantity and quality to base troops. But in that moment, the rule existed as cold water and the taste of metal. They shuffled past a line of 105mm howitzers, cleaned and parked as if for inspection. Trails clawed into the soil at neat intervals, tool rolls open, everything squared away. The guns smelled faintly of cordite. Weeks earlier, German pieces might have looked like that at first light, before fuel petered out and the last Luftwaffe escort became rumor. The contrast felt like judgment. He counted breaches without meaning to, then stopped because the number kept climbing. At a shaded table, military police of the 436th Escort Guard Company called names against a clipboard. Ranks, serials, units, weapons surrendered. Each fact entered a ledger that, Karl sensed, was part of a much larger accounting. He became a line item among the 250,000 Axis prisoners taken in North Africa. Numbers had never landed in his gut the way a single human moment did. Yet the calm pace of those pencils told a different truth. Scale had its own physics. You did not argue with gravity. Near noon, the harbor shifted from mirage to machinery. A gray hull showed through heat shimmer, a Liberty ship with cranes flexing and hatch covers drawn back. He had heard that American yards had built 2,710 of them, some in astonishing time. Around desert fires it had sounded like propaganda. Here, block and tackle creaked, slings rose and swung, and a second ship waited beyond the first. The Africa Corps had joked that America fought with factories. The joke had a new edge. The column formed on the pier, boots thudding with a hollow wooden music. The smell changed. Tar, rope, salt, sweat. Somewhere up the gangway, a sailor laughed, a light sound in a heavy day. Karl looked once more to the brittle hills where panzers lay scorched and half-buried in drifted sand. He could not fit it neatly as either defeat or ending. The sense was different. It was order without cruelty, power without hurry, the kind that did not need to declare itself. When he gripped the rail, the steel came up cool through his palm, surprising in the noon heat. On deck, the ship thrummed like a factory floor that had learned to float. Below, The hold smelled of oil and old rope. Above, gulls wheeled like torn paper. He would be processed, tagged, fed, and put on a train according to a timetable kept with the same grave tidiness as the gun line and the convoy. He could not name the feeling building behind his ribs, relief perhaps, or awe, but it had a shape he would come to recognize. The whistle raised a long, level note that ran over Cap Bon like a ruler across a map, measuring the distance to a country he could not yet imagine. They staged the prisoners on a hardpan field near the coast where thorn bushes cast mean little shadows and the sun slid from fierce to punishing. The Allied line was not dramatic. It was administrative. Medical tents, water points, registration tables, guard ropes, each placed with surveyor neatness. Carl felt the tempo more than he saw it, as if an unseen metronome clicked inside the operation. Triage first. A British captain with clipped vowels and a stethoscope that gleamed like jewelry under the sun. Dressings tightened, a shot for tetanus, salts for a man who collapsed. It was care with teeth. At the next station, an American lieutenant asked questions in careful German, tone dry, pen quick, name, rank, unit, last contact with higher headquarters. Carl answered with facts emptied of defiance. The lieutenant nodded, wrote, pointed, rations. The mess sergeant ladled stew that smelled of beef and onions. The scent itself a kind of shock. Bread followed, soft white slices that stuck to the teeth. A guard joked that the coffee was GI tar. The tin burned Carl's fingers. The taste was bitter and bottomless. He remembered dividing a biscuit 5 ways in the hills and felt something inside him loosen. They were issued camp tags and instructed firm, not cruel, on rules. No fraternizing with civilians, no hoarding. Work details to be assigned per capability. An escort guard company sergeant, sleeves rolled, explained that under Geneva rules they would receive rations equal to base troops and scrip for the canteen if they labored. The idea sounded like a story the world had no right to offer men who had lost. Yet the paperwork moved, and the system held. Late afternoon brought a walk to the quay. The Liberty ship loomed larger now, embossed numbers on her bow, reading like a factory ledger. It was said, the guard mentioned, that certain yards could launch a ship in under a week. Carl pictured a line of hulls sliding stern first into water with the regularity of a clock, and tried to imagine a Germany that could answer it. He could not. The wind shifted. Tar and diesel stitched the air. Boarding went by sections. At the gangway, a Navy petty officer counted aloud without glancing at faces, eyes on the tally, the efficiency impersonal and somehow humane. Below decks, the space was hot and smelled of rope, oil, men. A corpsman walked the aisle with a clipboard, tapping shoulders, checking fevers, distributing salt tablets like priestly wafers. "You'll feel better in a day," he said in the plain tone of a mechanic who knows his tools. Confidence ran through the ship the way current runs a wire. Night came down violet and then black, a lid clamped quietly in place. Somewhere aft a generator coughed into rhythm. Lights steadied to a workmanlike glow. Carl lay on a canvas bunk and felt the hull take a long, patient breath. He thought of Hamburg and the letter his mother would get from some office with a stamp. Thought of the battered Panzer IV crews who had fought until fuel was an idea. Thought of how the Allied convoy doctrine would likely shepherd dozens of ships like this across an ocean with method instead of miracles. The calm thrum under his ribs spoke of distance made trivial by organization. On deck, guards paced without hurry. A young American leaned on the rail and flicked a cigarette into the dark orange tip arcing, and then gone. The act felt careless and limitless, an extravagance measured not in arrogance, but in supply. For a long minute, Carl watched the phosphorescence wink in the harbor's chop and listened to the ship slot itself into the schedule of a nation that had learned to wage war with timetables as much as with guns. When the anchor chain rattled and the hull edged outward, the sound was not triumphal. It was exact. He closed his eyes to the hum of engines and a smell of coffee lingering in the passageway, the small mercies of a system that had no need to shout. Sleep came in slips and returns. The last thing he heard was a bosun's call piping thin and sure, a seam of sound threading the new night. In the morning, he told himself, there would be water, and bread that did not crumble, and a day measured by clocks that kept the same time everywhere. The first night at sea tasted of rope and rust. The Liberty ship's hull talked in slow iron syllables while destroyer escorts cut luminous scars in the dark, phosphorescence boiling at their knives' edges. Carl lay awake, counting the breaths of machinery, feeling the deck's faint tremor become a kind of lullaby. Somewhere above, a lookout called bearing and range. Somewhere below, a pump thudded like a patient heart. The convoy moved not as a collection of ships but as a single organism, columns, intervals, orders, its discipline expressed in distances measured by men who carried stopwatches and rules in their heads. Morning drew a pale line across the water and revealed the size of it. Tankers, freighters, troop ships, escorts weaving a quiet net. A Navy signalman with wind-reddened eyes leaned on the rail and told Carl in careful German that the pattern was the point. "We don't outrun wolves," he said, nodding toward the horizon. "We outnumber them. We outlast them." He pointed at a destroyer escort slicing past, depth-charge racks bristling, rails stacked with drums painted like thunder. The sailor said the convoy commander would zig when every nerve wanted to zag, that 100 lives could be saved by 5 degrees of turn ordered at the right second, and that the chart table mattered as much as a gun. The hours acquired routine. Lifeboat drill at the whistle's rasp. Mess lines that smelled of coffee and onions. Men permitted on deck in shifts to stretch and stare at nothing. The petty officer who kept the roster did so with the gravity of a quartermaster guarding a vault. He told anyone who would listen that American yards had built 2,710 Liberty ships, and once, swear to God, one of Kaiser's yards had launched a finished hull barely 5 days from keel to water. Carl had no way to test the boast, but the number lodged in him like a stone. If a single week could mint a ship, what could a year mint? The sailor laughed and said that in 1944, the United States would build so many airplanes that a day's output could shame whole nations. It felt like magic spoken prosaically, a ledger recited as prayer. At noon, the escorts practiced. The destroyer escort looped across the convoy's face and cut a pattern of white scars, hedgehog projector tilted like a crown of nails. Hydrophones whispered through black headphones. A petty officer called bearings in a voice that made numbers sound urgent. "Contact," someone said, and the ship shouldered into a turn. Charges walked across the surface in timing perfect blooms, water leaping, crashing down with the sound of torn canvas. The convoy did not panic. It flexed. Columns tightened. Throttles adjusted. The pattern held. When the escort returned to station, men exhaled through smiles they pretended were jokes. The wolves stayed under. Night brought blackout and the strange intimacy of ships sailing close but unseen. A boatswain's pipe stitched the dark with thin silver thread. The helmsman's corrections felt like mercy. Carl leaned against the warm funnel casing and listened to Americans talk about places like Portland and Detroit as if they were family members who sent money home. One said his sister riveted in a plant that turned out one bomber every hour on the hour during the busy runs. Another joked that a single truck plant could spew more axles in a day than Carl's army had seen in a month of retreat. The impossible sat beside the ordinary, as if abundance were simply the climate of their country. Days became a lesson in tempo, speed without hurry, power without spectacle. The convoy's code tended toward understatement. Slight modification to course meant a deliberate sweep that spared lives. Sea State building meant waves that would drown a careless man. The men who enforced that language wore salt-crusted dungarees and carried clipboards as if they were sidearms. They walked the line, counted heads, checked valves, signed papers, wound clocks, and made a war machine run by making minutes obey. Carl found a place at the rail near the bow, where spray tasted faintly of diesel. He thought of the Panzer IV crews back in Tunisia nursing empty tanks. He thought of the gun line with breeches polished like sermons. He did not yet think of allegiance. He thought of predictability as a kindness, and of schedules as guardians more reliable than promises. He slept easier as the ship's hum worked under him, steady as blood. They made land in gray weather. Dawn rose behind a smudge of coastline. Fog lifted like a stage curtain, and the skyline took a breath. Somewhere to port a band tried a march and abandoned it, laughing. The destroyer escort saluted with a turn sharp as a salute, foam knifing white. Tugs nosed in with the patience of old dogs. When the Liberty ship slid past a green statue carrying a torch, the deck fell quiet, not reverent exactly, but respectful of scale. Carl gripped the rail and watched the symbol of a place he did not yet understand slide by as if it were part of the convoy, another piece of infrastructure built to a purpose. The engines throttled back. The ship's voice dropped to a whisper, and then a purr, and in that gentle sound, he heard the end of a crossing and the start of something else. The train gathered them like cargo, and then surprised them by keeping time. From the harbor to the yard, the cars jolted, clanked, sighed. Then a Frisco locomotive shouldered its freight south, whistle pealing across lowland marsh, as if cutting fresh lanes in the air. Carl sat at a window wiped clear with his sleeve and watched the landscape unspool into a grammar he did not know. Pines and cotton, towns in red clay, depots where children counted the cars and waved as if greeting a parade that belonged to them. The guards rode easy, sure of the timetable, sure of the track. Power can be loud. Confidence can be quiet. Whistle stops showed a democracy of curiosity. Farmers stood in straw hats. Women in summer dresses fanned themselves with church bulletins. Boys in overalls leaned on bicycles painted with hard use. A Red Cross wagon clattered over boards. The smell of coffee hit like a memory from the harbor, hot and plentiful. A guard told Carl that Alabama would be hot long before noon, that the camp had shade trees and barracks by the hundred, and that if a man worked, he'd have scrip for the canteen. There was no sneer in it. He spoke like a foreman describing shifts. The cars creaked through a river crossing where water turned pewter under sun. On a siding, they yielded to a priority freight, flat cars stacked with GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, canvas tops folded like orderly tents. The convoy that wasn't yet seemed to gallop where the train could only stride. A sergeant tapped the window and said that back home, the country had built about 2.4 million military trucks, enough to pave a road from here to a horizon that forgot your name. Carl did the math with his thumb on the fogged glass and quit midway, not from doubt but from scale. The impossible was becoming a unit of measure. Past noon, the heat pressed down like a hand. Pine resin sweetened the air through a cracked vent. Men stripped off tunics and sat in undershirts, an intimacy made ordinary by the day's length. The guard detail from an escort guard company drifted the aisle with the mild vigilance of railroad men watching for sparks. One handed out leaflets, rules of conduct, notes on the 1929 Geneva Convention, a promise of rations equal to base troops, a reminder that stealing from local farms would end work privileges. The English was simple, the German translation respectful. It felt like a system talking to itself and including its enemies in the conversation. A town slid past where a hardware storefront showed rakes and plowshares and a single hunting rifle in the window. The American flag hung limp in noon's stillness. At the depot, a woman with flour on her apron lifted a small girl to see better. The child waved hard, then hid her face in her mother's neck. Mary Lou Benton, Carl would learn later, ran a farm not far from the camp and would take POW labor when crops demanded hands. For now she was an image, a pinprick in a windowed day that gathered itself into a future he could not name. Pine gave way to fields bleached to a harsh gold, then to a town whose sign read Aliceville. The train slowed into a scissoring clatter of switches. Heat poured into the cars when doors rolled back. The platform vibrated with the engine's breath. Beyond the depot, a geometry rose. Fences, towers, rows upon rows of low barracks, about 400 by Carl's quick astonished count, roofs winking in sun. The smell struck him: coffee, fried meat, yeast, camp kitchens working like factories. A military police corporal called cadence that was really just rhythm for order. The column flowed. Inside the wire, a mess hall line moved at a pace that felt like grace. A dietitian with captain's bars watched clipboards and steam table levels with the focus of a machine tender. She had the look of someone who could time a convoy by smell alone. Plates slid, ladles fell, bread stacked high. The white slices clung to fingers. A guard called the coffee boilerplate and poured without stinginess. Carl understood that abundance could be delivered with the same neutral hand as orders, and that it carried its own doctrine. The barracks smelled of wood and hot canvas. The bunk slats creaked with a humility that felt honest. Outside, cicadas drilled, and far off a freight moaned across the flats like a ship's whistle made of land. Carl sat and let sweat trace his ribs and thought of a nation that moved men by the thousand without losing count, that fed prisoners with the same schedule used to feed guards, that built buildings in fields and made them towns. When taps sounded from somewhere near the gate, the note floated above pine and tar and coffee like a length of wire pulled taut. Tomorrow, someone said, there would be work details. He lay back and let the timetables carry him. The gate clanked shut with the finality of a slammed ledger, and inside the wire the camp revealed itself as a city run by clipboards. Streets were graded, ditches cut square, towers set at measured intervals. Heat pressed down, but shade trees stamped coin shadows between about 400 low roofs. The place smelled of creosote, laundry steam, and coffee so strong it seemed to speak. A military police corporal walked them through the geometry like a factory tour behind barbed wire. Orientation felt like entering a machine built for people. At the administration hut, German NCOs were told they would police their own men under American oversight. Officers housed separately, ranks respected, trouble discouraged by certainty rather than threats. A bulletin board displayed rules in neat German script. Work details voluntary but paid in script. No fraternizing beyond the fence. Male censored but regular. Classes offered by visiting faculty from the university. It was discipline softened by routine and the certainty of schedules. The mess line ran with factory tempo. Steam rolled from kettles, tin plates rang, ladles fell. A woman officer, captain's bars bright against khaki, tracked quantities on a clipboard, eyes flicking from thermometers to scales. Captain Ellison, a private said, dietitian. She moved as if rations were munitions and every calorie a supply item placed on target. Under the 1929 Geneva rules, prisoners received food equal to base troops. Here that meant meat, beans, coffee, and white bread that stuck to the fingers. Numbers circulated as gossip. A guard bragged that at peak the kitchens could push 21,000 meals a day, and Carl believed it watching the service line glide. Elsewhere, men shouldered crates, scrubbed floors, hauled ice, the humble arts that keep a city running. In a recreation hall, a POW orchestra tuned, violins testing notes against the cicada buzz. A mimeographed sheet from a camp newspaper, Der Zaungast, the fenced guest, passed hand to hand, full of editorials, chess problems, and a poem about rain that made the room laugh. In the barracks, bunks were slatted, blankets clean, stoves ready for the short winter. The air tasted of pine and hot canvas. A Feldwebel organized their space with relief. Boots aligned heel to bunk leg, kit stacked square, a roster pinned beside the door. Carl lay on his back for a minute and heard the camp as a composite sound. Mess kettles, typewriters, hammer taps from a maintenance shed, the whine of a saw cutting planks to length. It was not martial music, but a tune of maintenance. Afternoons, when the boards exhaled heat, classes met. A professor from the University of Alabama, tie loosened, chalk on fingers, explained English idioms on a blackboard propped between bunks. "Close but no cigar," he wrote, and grinned when the room laughed at the strangeness. Carl repeated phrases and felt vocabulary open like a window. He had learned the language of drill. Now he tried words that belonged to sidewalks and stores. Evenings, the canteen window slid up and script changed hands. Men bought soap, razor blades, tobacco, writing paper, postcards with little flags in the corners. The cashier studied each purchase like a banker and made change that chimed in a tin tray. A rumor said beer would be offered on Sundays to working parties. It sounded like a fairy tale told in the language of receipts. Outside, a chalked baseball diamond waited for dusk. From the catwalk, the world narrowed to geometry. A rectangle paraded into smoothness, tower shadows moving like clock hands. Guards walked. Their boots set a rhythm with the crickets and the distant train whistle that stitched the dark. Carl wrote his mother by the weak light of a barracks bulb. "I am alive. I am treated well." The sentence felt inadequate and precise. Lights out arrived like a decision the whole camp made at once. When the generator throbbed and receded, he lay awake just long enough to hear the orchestra begin a waltz. It moved through the boards like a message. No triumph, no taunt, only tempo. Tomorrow, the sergeant had said, work details would post. Against all expectation, Carl felt a small, clean eagerness to see his name on the list. The work list posted at dawn. Kitchen, grounds, laundry, sawmill, farm crews. Carl's name fell under grounds, a shovel and a rake for shaping the camp's neat edges. He liked the honest fatigue, blisters answering to soap and sleep. Weeks became months, measured by scrip and the slow cool of fall. Then, in June 1944, a rumor arrived carried on the floodlights. A guard said it first over strong coffee. A U-boat taken alive, codes and all. Its crew smuggled to a camp in Louisiana. The story ran the fence line and returned with details that tasted true. Task Group 22.3, escort carrier USS Guadalcanal with destroyer escorts, boxed a Type 9C and took it on the 4th day of the month. 50-odd sailors, soaked and sullen, were pulled from black water while boarding teams hauled out codebooks, logs, a cipher machine, things that could turn sea into glass. Men said the camp was rustin'. The prisoners kept in a sealed compound without Red Cross mail, so nothing learned would leak back. Carl could not confirm it, but the rumor felt different from talk about baseball scores and canteen beer. It was built of nouns that did work. Boarding party, code book, carrier group, seizure. Sergeant McAllister vanished 10 days and returned leaner, quieter. He did not confirm the tale. His silence was shaped like yes. "Some captures have a long shadow," he said at last. He tapped the catwalk rail once, marking a boundary between what could be said and what the war still needed. At night, Carl thought of the submarine pinned on sonar, the escort carrier flinging airplanes into a sky that smelled of oil and salt. He pictured the U-boat's gray back-breaking surface, hooks clanging, sailors driven out by charges and shouted English, a coxswain counting heads as if on a ledger. He had been taught victory came from spirit and shock, the sharp edge of assault. What he heard was different. It was victory by combination. electronics, doctrine, the will to treat information as a commodity to be extracted and protected. The next week, the camp library received new bulletins. Captain Ellison read them at the mess table between temperature checks, lips moving, eyes narrowed, as if charting something only she could see. "Feed schedules," she said when Carl asked what good secrets did. "Convoys route around wolves. Ships live longer. Men go home." She said nothing about cryptology or silent rooms, but the implication hung like heat before a storm. Time jump. The summer bent toward autumn, news arriving in jolts, landings in France, Russian advances, cities with names that tasted like metal. In the canteen, a radio hummed with voices so calm they made disaster sound like a train arriving on time. Carl learned the escort carrier was CVE 60 and filed the number away like a verse. He learned the phrase Type 9C and understood that even the enemy's class had become an inventory item for a system that sliced war into categories and assigned work. On a Sunday, he watched the orchestra rehearse and realized the rumor had turned his thinking a notch. He no longer imagined the United States as a giant with endless arms. He pictured linked hands, each doing an exact task at the exact second a clock demanded. That image made other scenes click. Convoy choreography, timetable authority, the way a dietitian could command a city's appetite with a pencil. When warm rain came, the barracks roof answered each drop as if tallying. Carl lay awake and let the sum run. Somewhere west, behind a second fence, men who had stalked his convoys now waited under lights, while knowledge from their boat redrew others' routes. He did not feel glee or malice. He felt the gravity of process. Some captures had long shadows, and some shadows changed the shape of a continent. In the morning, new postings listed farm crews for harvest, names like his, bound for fields beyond the wire where America's abundance grew in straight rows. The truck that took them to the fields was the color of the road. Dust worked into olive drab until the GMC CCKW looked born from the county itself. The driver bounced them past cotton rows into a yard where a woman in a sun hat waited with her hands on her hips. "Mary Lou Benton," she said, as if introducing a farm as well as herself. "You'll pick on the East 40 this morning. Water's in the shade. Don't step on my rows." Her voice held a sergeant's authority, and the men answered with small nods. Carl shifted his cap and felt heat gather at the back of his neck. The soil was dry on top, damp beneath, earth that clung to the fingers. They worked in pairs, a guard ambling the headland, rifle slung. At break, Mary Lou brought a galvanized bucket of iced tea, beaded with sweat. The first swallow shocked, cold, sweet, impossibly generous. "You boys keep at it and we'll have pie Sundays," she said. Carl's hands learned the row's rhythm, bend, twist, drop, step, a metronome of tendon and breath. He knew the feel of a rifle bolt in sand. Now he learned the burr's sting that lingered past bath and bunk. The guard, a lanky Arkansan, filled the silence with claims that sounded like tall grass hiding a steel rail. "Back home," he said, "we got plants stamping axles so fast a day's run could outfit a panzer regiment 6 times over." He added that the country had built about 2.4 million military trucks. Enough, he joked, to drive to Berlin and still have spares to circle the city. Carl smiled, despite himself. Numbers came like weather here, accepted, rarely argued. At noon, Mary Lou rang a bell. They ate in the shade, cold meat, white bread that stuck to the teeth, cucumber pickles sharp enough to clean the tongue. The guard told a different kind of story, the kind that lived in schedules rather than legends. He said a place up north, Willow Run, had turned out bombers by the hour at its peak, one B-24 Liberator every 60 minutes when the line was hot. He said it the way a man tells a timetable. Even if the figure was boastful, the shape remained, production that behaved like tide. Afternoon lengthened. A radio between songs recited names of towns in France, as if ticking boxes. The harvest wagon creaked and filled. A wasp circled the water spigot with proprietary rights. Carl's shoulders burned. He did not feel punished. Work here was not a sentence. It gave something back. Scrip at the gate, a line in the ledger, maybe pie. When the truck brought them through the perimeter, the canteen window slid up like a curtain. The cashier took scrip and pushed out tobacco, postcards, a tin of salve. Carl bought paper and wrote in a careful hand about fields that yielded without fear, about a woman who measured a man by his row, not his past, about iced tea that tasted like permission. Later he lay on the barrack steps and watched floodlights come alive in sequence, towers clicking on like stars obeying a sergeant. A baseball thumped a mitt on the parade ground. Laughter rose and settled. He remembered splitting a biscuit 5 ways in Tunisia and put the memory away like a relic that no longer fit the pocket. A guard strolling by said one city in Michigan could make more M1 Garand rifles in a season than his regiment had ever seen. Carl did not bother to test the arithmetic. He had learned that numbers here cast their own shadows. When taps sounded, he lay in a clean fatigue. In the darkness he pictured assembly lines like rivers, each workstation a bend carrying metal toward a shape with wings or wheels. He did not yet say he wanted to stay. He acknowledged he did not want to go back. Between those truths, a country took form the way dawn does, quietly, with equipment already running. The radio in the canteen spoke with a calm that cut through heat. News came in stacked sentences, a beachhead widening, a river crossed, a city relieved. Between bulletins, swing crackled. For a minute the camp smelled less of creosote and more of waxed floors Carl had never seen. What held him was not style but scale. Captain Ellison spread figures on the mess table and tapped each line. 1944, she said. The factories are in full voice. She named numbers the way gunners name ranges. Nearly 96,000 American military aircraft would leave assembly lines this year alone, more than double what Germany could coax from battered plants. Willpower could not close such a gap. 49,000 M4 Shermans, she added, not counting engines, radios, optics, and the men trained to use them. She let that sit while a private refilled coffee. About 5.5 million M1 Garands by war's end, she said. The numbers felt like weather maps, fronts rolling, pressure building. Carl remembered the convoy, the Liberty ship's iron pulse, the timetable that ran like a law of nature. He realized he had been seeing pieces of one machine and mistaking parts for the whole. A guard wandered by and added his favorite fact. 2.4 million military trucks since '39, he said. You can win a war on trucks if you know what to put in the back. At evening formation, an MP read announcements, work rosters, mail call, then glanced at a slip. Production photo display, rec hall, 1900. In the hall, pictures ran a wall, rows of B-24s rolling nose to tail, women at rivet guns, tank hulls stacked like loaves. A caption said a certain plant could push a bomber every hour when lines were hot. Even if boastful, the floor-to-ceiling space made it plausible. He had trusted the sharpness of tactics. Now he understood the strength of tempo. War at this scale obeyed clocks. A corporal pointed at a graph. In a single year, American aircraft output could exceed entire Axis totals from earlier years. On the walk back, catwalk guardrails threw long stripes, parallel lines guiding motion, boundaries needing no explanation. Soldiers joked Americans measured victory in tonnage. That evening he believed it without contempt. Machine tools chattered like cicadas, everywhere patient, unstoppable. The strangest thing was not totals, but the mood that produced them. Factories turned because people believed they should. Schedules held because someone held them. A democracy had made compulsion unnecessary so it could be overwhelming on the battlefield, an irony he might have missed if the coffee had been worse and the trucks fewer. Later, he sat on the barrack step with a pencil and listed what he knew. Convoys guarded by doctrine. Ships built by the thousand. Tanks in the tens of thousands. Rifles by the millions. Trucks more than a man could count in an afternoon. Each item had human weight. Sailors alive because a code book was captured. Farmers fed because trains kept schedules. Prisoners treated well because a rule was enforced and a kitchen staffed. He bracketed the list and wrote a line above it. Arithmetic made into mercy. The floodlights clicked on. From the far end of camp came the thump of a ball and the smack of leather. The sound reminded him that strength here arrived without swagger. It simply arrived. Word drifted that autumn that repatriation lists would follow victory lists, that trains could carry men home the way they carried trucks to ports. Carl folded his totals and felt a future loosen from the past. Spring sagged into the wires like a tired flag and then lifted. Dogwoods put out white hands beyond the fence, and a south wind ran the camp streets as if checking the geometry. The radio spoke in a new register, bridges crossed, armies meeting. Then the sentence everyone would remember was delivered in a voice that did not rise. Hitler dead in Berlin. The mess hall went quiet, except for the steady breath of the steam table. Sergeant McAllister stood in the doorway as if he'd been set there to witness endings. Someone cheered. Captain Ellison didn't. She just turned to her clipboards with the same calm that had fed enemies as if they were her own. By evening, rumors moved with the dust. Repatriation lists, trains, ships. A clock that would take you back to the ruins that had sent you here. Carl walked the perimeter and watched a freight pass miles away. A thin sound, like a saw at work. He felt the pull of home and its absence at the same time, a rope tugging both directions. Letters had told him firestorms ate the city's night. His mother wrote of neighbors gone, of cellars that smelled of damp wool and fear. In the barracks, a man folded a postcard of the harbor and said he would kiss the ground of any German station that still had glass in the windows. Another said he'd stay if a door opened. They both looked at the floor after the words were spoken, as if they'd dropped metal. Work went on because it knew no other way. The fields wanted hands. The sawmill wanted shoulders. At lunch, Mary Lou Benton brought pie just as she'd promised that first day, and served slices with the matter-of-fact grace of a quartermaster issuing confidence. "War'll end into work same as it began into work," she said, pushing plates across a plank table. "Storm breaks, you still need a roof." The guard nodded and added a fact that hung in the shade like a pennant. Willow Run Up in Michigan had, by now, turned out over 8,000 B-24 Liberators, one plant outbuilding the air forces of countries that had swaggered into headlines. Carl tasted the pie and tried to imagine a bakery that never closed. 100 ovens in rows, each pushing food for the sky. The camp newspaper ran a sober editorial: pack light, write addresses clearly, mind your manners on trains, and a poem that made fun of those who claimed they'd never doubted victory. Carl wrote and rewrote a letter he didn't send. "I don't know where I belong," he scribbled, then struck the line. He walked the diamond at dusk and watched guards pace with ordinary fatigue, their cadence syncing with crickets and a far-off whistle that stitched land to land. He wanted the comfort of a timetable and feared the destination it promised. Night brought newsprint on fingers, and the small economy of scrip counted out for cigarettes and soap. A young MP said his brother would be out of the Pacific soon, that cargo ships and planes and trucks had made islands feel like train stations on a line you could know by heart. "We win because we keep schedules," he said, almost apologetically, as if admitting a lack of poetry. Carl thought of convoys sheltering under rules, of codebooks captured and locked away, of kitchens humming like factories with ladles instead of cranes. He decided poetry was not missing. It just came in meters of tonnage and calories. When darkness deepened, the orchestra tried a waltz, and then There'll be a hot time in the old town tonight, which made the guards grin. The tune slid under doors and down the cool aisles of the barracks. Carl lay on his bunk and listened for a feeling that would make the future obvious. It did not arrive. What did arrive was a small certainty he could carry. Abundance had weight. It gave, it steadied, it argued without speeches. If he returned, he would carry that argument like a tool. If he stayed, it would be the grammar of his days. The lights dimmed, the generator settled, and the night held its breath as if waiting for a train already on the timetable, already whistling somewhere between here and a country trying to remember itself. The library smelled of paste and old cloth, and in that perfume of quiet the camp received the war's balance sheet. The bulletin board wore charts like campaign ribbons, and Captain Ellison, who measured meals with a gun captain's precision, walked Carl through columns as if touring a battlefield map. "Start here," she said, fingertip on 1940, "and watch the slope." The line climbed like a ramp taking a city wall. Steel, aluminum, radios, tires, all the nouns that make a mechanized army more than flags and brass. She did not crow. She traced. "Factories are organs," she said. "You can hear them breathing at shift change." Carl stood before a photograph that made factories feel like theology. 4 rows of M4 Sherman hulls shouldered side by side, a perspective trick turning abundance into infinity. The caption didn't bother with adjectives, about 49,000 produced. The numbers Carl had heard in fragments at the canteen wall arranged themselves into a grammar. Trucks by the million, roughly 2.4 million, so that meals, shells, and men arrived where they were wanted, when they were wanted. Rifles by the million, 5.5 million M1 Garands, so a citizen army could fire as if born to it. Aircraft by the year's sky, almost 96,000 in 1944 alone. So air became a medium Americans owned by schedule. He thought of the Africa he had known, fuel measured by the cup, water by the swallow, trucks dying by the mile from heat and want. He had believed Will could beat arithmetic if Will arrived fast enough. The board said otherwise. Arithmetic had marched quietly, hauling its own bridges and kitchens, and when it arrived, it stayed. At a table, a guard in shirt sleeves explained supply in a way that made Carl smile. "War's a restaurant with no last call," the man said, drawing boxes on scrap paper. He sketched convoys like beads and depots like pockets. If the cook never runs out, the fight never has to. The cook, Carl saw, wore many uniforms. A girl on a drill press, a man counting boxcars, a dietitian standing over thermometers. Their ranks were not on their collars. They were in their totals. Outside, a freight moaned, and the camp paused for its note, the way a congregation pauses for a bell. Carl remembered the U-boat rumor, the way secrecy had fed roots, and roots had fed survival. Columns on the board marked radios, sonar sets, tubes and valves, quiet parts that never made posters. He imagined them as tendons in an arm, unseen, decisive. He did not try to carry the whole. He let the music of it move through him. A democracy had arranged its noises, hammers, whistles, lunch pails, policy, into a march that didn't need a drum. McAllister drifted in, saw the charts, and stopped like a man in church hearing a hymn from childhood. "That's what we felt on the road," he said, gesturing at the truck totals. The ground shaking. "Not from guns, from logistics." He tapped the top line with a knuckle. "Men get tired. Schedules don't." Ellison smiled at that, not because it was pretty, but because it was correct. Before lights out, Carl copied the core numbers into his notebook, not as trophies, but as a map he could keep if the library closed. He added a smaller total that mattered only to him. Meals served in captivity that had kept his weight and his soul from wasting. A mercy expressed in pounds and minutes. Arithmetic again, this time with grace in it. The generator's hum deepened by a note as if agreeing. When he left, the charts still glowed in the library's low light, steady as beacons marking a harbor he had sailed without knowing the names of the buoys. September arrived with the smell of dust cooled by first rain, and the gate's hinges sounded different when they opened. Less like closure, more like hinge. The notice board listed names under a word that made men stand straighter: movement. Carl's was there, spelled correctly, an American neatness he had grown to trust. He folded his blanket to regulation squares and stacked it on a bunk he would not see again. The barracks felt lighter, as if furniture had been lifted out of his chest. In the mess, Captain Ellison passed him a second helping with the same businesslike mercy she had shown on all the other days. Routine was the honor guard she could offer. Out at the yard, Mary Lou Benton waited by the truck, hat in hand. "I brought pie for the road," she said, embarrassment tucked into the corner of her mouth. He didn't have the German for what he wanted to say about work and shade and cold tea in a bucket, so he said thank you twice and let the word carry more than it seemed to weigh. McAllister shook his hand like a man signing off a good shift. "Trains keep their times," the sergeant said. "You'll be all right, wherever this one goes." It sounded less like comfort than like a law. Processing was a soft machinery. Tags collected, pay script converted or donated, books returned, postcards purchased because farewells require inventory. The camp's orchestra played in the recreation hall as if to bless the paperwork, a tune that was half parade, half prayer. At the gate, a corporal checked names with his pencil, the same pencil that had called them in months ago. Symmetry existed here because someone made it so. Beyond the fence, a siding held cars with windows raised against the afternoon. They smelled of rope and pine and the ghost of coffee that would be poured somewhere down the line. Carl climbed into a car that looked east and sat with his pack and his notebook. The train moved with a physical courtesy, easing into speed so even the nervous could keep their thoughts together. The camp slid backward into geometry, then into memory. Fields stepped away and forests stepped in. At a junction, the train paused for a freight. Flat cars of trucks again, still moving to ports because the world needed carrying even after the shooting paused. Carl understood then that schedules were not war's invention, but its inheritance. Peace would need them like lungs. He pressed his forehead to glass made hot by sun and let the rhythm of the rails untie the knots behind his eyes. Night collected them. Guards walked the aisle not as jailers but as ushers tending a congregation that did not yet know its hymns. A boy, he couldn't have been 20, offered water from a jug and a grin that reached both corners of the car. Someone started a song in a low voice, and for once it wasn't a marching tune. At a small-town depot, a woman lifted her child to see. The girl waved with the solemn focus of an officer taking an oath. Carl lifted his hand and returned the salute. He wrote by the sway of the car, "I will try to find you. I am alive because of strangers who ran their clocks well." The words did not ask permission of the future. They built a bridge to it plank by plank. When the train slid past the last tower and into a mouth of darkness that smelled like timber and river water, Carl closed his notebook and slept as if he were on a schedule, which he realized he was. Morning would be new orders, new rails, a harbor where ships could wait without hurrying, and a sky unpunctured by sirens. The camp, which had taught him the grammar of abundance, receded without bitterness. He carried the language with him. Years later, with a citizen's papers in his pocket worn soft by habit, Carl told his children the story of the first slice of American white bread he ever tasted. He began not with guns or flags, but with a canteen of cold water pressed into his hand by a freckled medic who treated procedure like kindness. He spoke of trains that kept time as if time were a living thing to be fed, and of kitchens that produced mercy at a pace that would have shamed small cities. "We were enemies," he said, "and they fed us like they fed their own." It sounded sentimental until he reached for numbers, and then sentiment became structure. They built about 296,000 military aircraft across the war, he said, and in 1944 alone, almost 96,000, a year's worth that would have taken other nations a lifetime. Impossible statistics did not inflate the tale. They anchored it. He talked about the convoy that moved like a school of iron fish, and about the Liberty ship that throbbed beneath his boots, as if a factory had learned a sailor's gait. He talked about Willow Run turning out more than 8,000 B-24s at one address, and about trucks, some 2.4 million, that gave strategy legs. He explained, with the patience of a man who had learned English by chalkboard and baseball diamond, that democracy had not needed to terrify him to defeat him. It had needed to deliver. It had needed to show up on time. Sometimes he would stop and open the notebook he had carried from the camp. The pages held clean block letters, totals, dates, small observations that looked like prayer when read backward. Men are fed, therefore men live. Ships sail, therefore cities breathe. Rules are obeyed, therefore mercy scales. He didn't pretend America had been without harshness or error. He spoke instead about intent expressed as logistics, about the strange tenderness of a country that could afford to be generous and chose to be. It had not been softness. It had been strength at such scale that cruelty was a waste of time. On quiet evenings, he wrote to Mary Lou Benton and to McAllister, letters that took the long road and still arrived. He sent holiday cards to Captain Ellison addressed to whatever hospital kitchen or veterans ward she served next. In the margins of his new life, shift work, night classes, a mortgage figured as carefully as any supply table, he heard echoes, a boatswain's pipe, a whistle on the flats, the murmur of a mess line that never once ran out before his tray reached the ladle. When a siren in his city announced only noon, he smiled without explaining. At memorials, he stood straight and did not apologize for his past. He honored men who fell on ground scorched into glass and men who fell beside machines that made abundance. He told his children that the war had not been decided only at beaches or in cities whose names books italicize. It had been decided in factories and farms where people believed that schedules could save lives. They were free, he said, and they behaved like it. That's what defeated us. He didn't mean parades. He meant clipboards and clocks, and the ethic behind them. Once, asked what changed him, he said, "A slice of bread and the quiet confidence that there would always be another." He had never again divided a biscuit 5 ways. He had also never again looked at a train schedule without gratitude. When he folded his hands at the table and bowed his head, old habits repurposed, he thanked the country that had measured mercy in tons and minutes and proved that abundance, administered with discipline, could turn enemies into neighbors. The numbers remained, but they no longer needed proving. The life around them was the proof.